Hey homies, what is up? It's the Tominator, and today I want to do another top 10 countdown. These are always fun, and this is a topic I haven't covered yet, despite it being absolutely crucial to succeeding as a bodybuilder at the highest levels. And of course, we're talking about conditioning. But before we dive into this, I think it's important to define what we mean here first. So, what is conditioning exactly? Well, I'll give you a hint. We're not talking about Pavlov's dogs here. In bodybuilding terms, to put it simply, conditioning refers to how lean and defined your muscles are. How much detail can you see there? Striations, feathering, separation, tie-ins, hardness, dryness, graininess, vascularity, muscle maturity, even the very thinness of the skin itself. These are all things that contribute to good conditioning. That said, you don't necessarily need to exhibit all of these features in order to be considered well-conditioned. Some guys are just genetically not predisposed to being overly vascular or might not have the best muscular separation, but they can still come in dry and peeled. To that end, the most essential aspect of conditioning, I would say, is dryness, because without being purposefully dehydrated, your muscles will tend to look soft and watery. Being extremely lean is prerequisite as well, of course, but that should go without saying for pro bodybuilders in contest shape. Anyway, we'll note the various forms that conditioning can take in just a moment when we examine the different types of physiques that made this list. Okay, so now that we have a better understanding of what we're talking about here, let me just briefly mention what we're not talking about. As was the case for my top 10 freakiest mass monsters video, I will not be featuring any bodybuilders who didn't compete at the Olympia level, okay? I've seen some other lists out there that showcase a bunch of amateurs or social media guys who aren't anywhere near the size of the top professionals and obviously don't boast the same competitive credentials. And to me, that's not really fair to lump them in with all these elite IFBB juggernauts who are able to show up shredded at 240 plus pounds. Because let's face it, it's a lot harder to get freakishly lean when you're simultaneously packing crazy amounts of muscle. Getting jacked as shit and ripped to the bone at the same time is a very difficult feat to pull off, so the men featured here all deserve some serious props. Keeping that last point in mind, here's the first honorable mention in the form of Dave Palumbo, who only misses the cut by technicality because he never managed to earn his pro card, let alone compete at the Mr. Olympia. Nevertheless, Dave deserves recognition for achieving insane conditioning and vascularity at an extremely massive body weight. And I urge those of you with weak stomachs to turn away now because this shit is downright nasty. And I mean that in both senses of the word. First as a compliment because it is impressive development, but also literally because it's frankly kind of disgusting to have legs that dang veiny. Okay, but let's move on to the actual list. Coming in at number 10, we have the Boston Mass Jose Raymond. The recently retired veteran of the 212, formerly 202 pound class, Jose boasts a distinguished resume as a regular top 4 or 5 finisher, and that is largely the result of all his dense and conditioned muscle mass. Jose is included because even though he never had the greatest separation or detail per se, he did have a ridiculously grainy and gritty sort of muscle. The texture of his physique was more akin to some hard old tree bark than ordinary human skin. It was just gnarly, man. I mean, look at all the veins snaking through his chest and everything. This is what muscle maturity looks like, kids. You can't get to this level without many years of heavy drug-enhanced training under your belt, and even then it's largely down to genetics. The main reason Jose doesn't place any higher is because, like I said, his separation could have been better, and he never displayed much in the way of striations or feathering. At number 9, we have one of the OGs of conditioning, Rich Gaspari. Back in the 80s, Rich was one of the first, if not the first, to ever present striated glutes on stage. So he kind of ushered in this phenomenon, which we take for granted today as one of the mandatory staples of conditioning. Rich was also highly vascular, as this gym photo poignantly illustrates. It almost looks like his veins are ready to crawl out from beneath his skin. Jesus, bro, don't pop a blood vessel on us now. Even when he was being aesthetic, the veininess was still prominent. So Rich was one of the first to bring that super hard and vascular look along with striated glutes. He was something of an innovator in that sense. And you may be wondering then why he places so low. Well, let's just say that Gaspari was insane for his day, way ahead of the curve. But standards evolve, and compared to several guys that would come after, he just wasn't quite as peeled in certain areas. For example, Sean Ray, who clocks in at number 8. Ray was noted for being consistently conditioned throughout his entire career. He never sacrificed definition to play the mass game, And while he might have never been as grainy or veiny as Gaspari or Raymond, he certainly boasted superior detail overall. Ray was always sliced and diced from head to toe. The cuts, the striations, the tie-ins between muscle groups, every body part was just positively chock full of quality detail. So much so that he often resembled a finely chiseled statue. And a lot of this is due to his rather thin and tight skin, which allowed every minutia of the muscle to shine through. Spoiler alert, but Flex Wheeler there to his right did not make the list because despite looking razor sharp here, 1993 was really the only year where he brought this level of conditioning. After that, he generally looked considerably smoother, compromising his definition even further by using sight enhancement oils towards the tail end of his career. But back to Sean, the only thing holding him back from a higher placing here is the fact that he was never necessarily the driest or hardest. His muscles always had a slightly softer look to them, even when he was at his best, so that's why he lands down at number 8. Fittingly enough, we have the former 7-time Mr. Olympia, Phil Heath, coming in at number 7. Whenever we speak of Phil's virtues, the first descriptions that typically come to mind are his 3D effect, the round muscle bellies, and all the sharp separation that he brings. But one thing that tends to get overlooked and underestimated is his superb conditioning. Midsection aside, Phil has always come in great shape throughout his career, just like Sean Ray before him. Interestingly enough, the gift has essentially the same thin skin as Ray as well, not just metaphorically speaking, but literally in this case. That paper-thin skin is what enables him to show off every little groove and striation, so when he turns around and flexes his hamstrings, we can practically discern the individual muscle fibers firing and tensing. As he got older, his muscles matured and took on a more grainy appearance, as we can note here when he was at probably his all-time driest in 2016. Phil doesn't place any higher, however, as he always tended to lack that muscle density, that hardness that comes from lifting
heavy-ass weight.
It ain't nothing but a peanut for Ronnie Coleman, who lands at number 6. Ronnie was a freak of nature, alright? Nobody in history has ever been this huge and shredded as Big Ron at his peak. Originally, believe it or not, I didn't even have Ronnie making the top 10 at all because often the way you might remember him is as this bloated mass monster holding too much water from the front, but Ronnie was always absolutely peeled from behind, and he simply had too many amazing showings to omit when you think about his track record, the 98, 99, and 2003 Olympias, the 2001 Arnold Classic, and this here, which I believe was from the '01 New Zealand Pro, in which he boasted a bona fide Christmas tree in the freaking rear relax pose of all things. Practically unheard of, and needless to say, the Christmas tree is one of the truest indicators of top-notch conditioning. Ronnie was a damn uncaged animal, and one of the most impressive sights you will ever witness on a bodybuilding stage. The only reason he doesn't place higher is because, as mentioned, he did have several contests where he was holding too much water, and so his consistency left some room for improvement. Unlike this next gentleman at number 5, Dexter Jackson. They don't call him the Blade for nothing, folks. He was pretty much the epitome of razor-sharp conditioning, and while he may never have been quite as ridiculously shredded as Ronnie in his prime, he was definitely far more consistent over his extraordinarily long and illustrious career. Dexter's the very definition of consistency. You look it up in the dictionary, his picture is right there, man. He has some of the sharpest separation going as well, and while he may have been a little tighter when he was younger, and isn't that always the case, ladies, as he aged, he acquired that drier, grainier texture, that old man muscle is what they call it. Regardless of what number you personally might choose to assign him here, I think we can all agree that Dexter needs to be on any top 10 most conditioned list. Branch Warren finds himself way up there at number 4. Love him or hate him, when it comes to conditioning, you can't deny that Branch was one of the best to ever do it. He was like an even bigger and better version of Jose Raymond. Despite his relatively poor separation, Branch brought that grainy and veiny freak factor all day, baby. His muscles were hard as a rock most times, so much so that if you squint a bit, he almost begins to resemble the Thing from the Fantastic Four. The coloring is certainly comparable anyway. But in all seriousness, the sheer thickness and density of Branch's body was just unbelievable. The only reason he fails to crack the top 3 is because his separation needed some work, and he was never quite as detailed from the back as he was from the front and sides. And speaking of rock hard, freaky mass, who better exemplifies these qualities than the shadow himself, Dorian Yates? Dorian is my pick for number 3 because nobody ever brought that level of raw, hard density like he did. It was almost as though his physique had been literally carved from solid granite. In fact, he might even deserve that number 2 spot. I was having a pretty tough time making up my mind there, but ultimately decided he should remain in 3rd because of the fact he never possessed much in the way of striations or feathering or any of that. Well, aside from that crazy-ass Christmas tree, that is. Yikes, man, that's gotta be the most serrated and downright fearsome lower backs in history. He even outdoes the likes of Sean Ray, who himself had one of the most impressive Christmas trees out there. One thing's for sure, at his peak, like he was in 95 and here in 93, Dorian Yates' remarkable combination of mass and ripped conditioning was virtually unbeatable. Okay, and this next bodybuilder at number 2 was a little leaner and a lot more obscure, but he was on another level when it comes to thin skin and striated muscle. In fact, judging by some pictures such as this, I'm not even sure he had skin. Hamdullah was like a walking anatomy chart. And for anyone questioning why a smaller, lesser-known guy like this makes my top 10, rest assured, we're not breaking any rules here. He did in fact compete at the Olympia back in 1993, as depicted here. And sweet fancy Moses, have you ever seen more striations packed into a single chest before? It's almost as though each individual muscle fiber of the pectorals is fully exposed and on display. Anatomists would have had a veritable field day with this guy. The only reason he didn't outright top the list is because one other bodybuilder managed to edge him out. But before we get to that number 1, let's just quickly run through a couple of honorable mentions for those who didn't quite make the cut. Firstly, we have to mention Frank Zane, who was revered not merely for his aesthetics, but also all the polish that went along with it. But just like we saw with Rich Gaspari earlier on, Frank was a victim of evolution. While he was undoubtedly one of the most ripped of his day, the more modern drugs and diuretics that came onto the scene in later decades were simply too much for him to compete with. But still, I had to give Zane a shout out. Oz Liddell is another name that probably warrants a mention. This guy has become known in recent years for his outstanding conditioning, and also for sporting some of the craziest glutes of all time. Ultimately, I decided to drop him in favor of Ronnie Coleman, though. And lastly, we shouldn't forget about James Flex Lewis, whose 7 consecutive 212 Olympia titles are largely owing to his crisp conditioning and stellar separation. With his round, full muscle bellies and narrower frame, he's essentially a shorter version of Phil Heath and easily could have made it on here. At the end of the day, I elected to go with his fellow competitor Jose Raymond, however, because of his extra graininess and vascularity, 2 attributes that Lewis always lacked. And finally, we come to the moment of truth. For now, we arrive at that number 1 spot, and come on, you all knew this was coming. You should have called it before even clicking the video. I mean, who else could it be but the one and only Andreas Munzer, the most ripped bodybuilder of all time, bar none. Munzer effectively gave his life in his quest to become the most conditioned bodybuilder on the face of the planet, which involved copious amounts of dangerous diuretics. But if you thought that last Hamdullah fellow was shredded and striated, Munzer might as well have been nicknamed the Shredder because he displayed probably more striations than have ever been present on a single human body before or since. Look at the triceps, the delts, the pecs. Hell, Munzer probably had striated eyelids for all I know. The man even had a vascular back, for fuck's sakes. I mean, some of this stuff shouldn't be physically possible. The level of detail jam-packed in here, especially when you scan over to the smaller body parts like the shoulders and arms, is simply staggering. He also had a highly underrated set of wheels with deeply separated quads, feathered all the way up to the hip. Now, you can argue the order of the rest of this list all you want, but there is no debate when it comes to the most conditioned bodybuilder of all time, and that is Andreas Munzer. Thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you enjoyed. This one really took a fair bit of time to research and select good picks and prepare and everything, so please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think I missed anyone? Again, keep in mind we are only talking about Olympia-level participants, remember? But as always, feel free to leave a like and subscribe for more, and until next time, I'm the Tominator, signing out, and I'll be back.